There was no money. My mother had to cope with 10 shillings a week. We were fortunate because we had chickens and my father grew so many vegetables, and we were lucky in that respect because they didn't have an employment benefit. Not until the pits were closed 6 weeks. And then when they did have benefit, it was 26 shillings a week, I think it was. The old money.
We had a maid at one time called Lizzie, who lived in. Before that, we had a woman called Rachel. She spoke Welsh, but could also speak English, so she taught me a few words. She never wore her false teeth. She said she kept them in a drawer.
I was courting a girl who was keeping house for one Mr. Thomas, a retired farmer at Parc y Dyffryn, and that was the strangest mode of courtship I ever came in contact with. If you met your girl on the road, or going the same way, you must not talk to her on a Sunday. It was reckoned a most wicked thing to do, a real big sin. All courting must and was done inside the house, but I don't expect you to believe me. Nevertheless, it is the truth, the real truth, and nothing but the truth.
My mother went to Bethesda Baptist Chapel regularly, and we always sat in the same pew, number 41 on the right-hand side. I found the services very boring and probably fidgeted a lot. To amuse me, my father would fold his big white handkerchief to make a mouse, or he would often pass me a round white mint imperial sweet to suck, so the time would pass more quickly.
And my mother tells me that when my great-grandfather was ill, he used to smoke a clay pipe, and she used to light it for him when he was ill in bed. She was typical of women of that generation, working class women who had permed hair and wore a kind of coverall apron, I don't know, almost like a dress.
I was a very sickly child, having had bronchial pneumonia each year for 9 years and double pneumonia 3 times. But for the loving care and attention of my mother, I would never have lived through it all. In those days, antibiotics had not been heard of, and I recovered from each attack solely through the use of mustard poultices to my back and chest.
When I was about 6 years old, I was very ill with a mastoid abscess in my left ear. I remember the pain, and my mother heating Carolyn, spreading this black paste on a square of lint and pressing it on my head just behind the ear as her poultice. For a week I lay in bed. The doctor came each day but could do nothing more.
Yes, and now my mother's mother was marvellous cook, and she was she sewed, she did everything. There were 6 children, and she baked bread, she did everything for the family, and she still lived till she was 86.
My mother would bake the bread, and then put it to rise, and then she would put it in, grease the tins and everything, then put it in the tins, keep some out back, and she'd make a couple of batches just for us to have a treat. Yeah. And then, but she'd make her own mark on the top, and the lady in the bakehouse knew everybody's mark. And then when I come home, she would give me the money for the bread, tie it up in a hanky that she would have made, and I used to knickers with a pocket in it. And it was in that pocket so I wouldn't lose it. And I would go, and I was only little, and then I'd have 3 big tins to carry home. Oh, I never dropped them, I don't know. No. But each loaf had a little bit over the side, and that was real crusty. And my mother then, as a treat, would break that piece off and put butter on it and give it to me.
On wash days, my mother would light a coal fire in the old black range in the scullery to boil water in kettles. When I was a child, my mother had no gas or electric stove for cooking. These luxuries came much later. She cooked on a paraffin stove with 2 burners. One of these heated a small oven, and on the other a saucepan or frying pan could be used. Although the oven was very small, she cooked delicious food, especially joints of roast meat and fruit tarts. This small back kitchen was very cold in winter, and we spent as little time as possible in it.
There was no sewers through Templeton, and the house was built with a toilet sort of attached but outside, because it was a chemical toilet. And then you went in to what was called the kitchen, and which I suppose you'd call a family kitchen now, because it had a range, coal-fired range, and a table and chairs, and easy chairs as well, and that's where life was lived.
For our daily washing routine, we took hot water up to the bedrooms and washed ourselves in a basin which stood on a washstand. This water had to be carried downstairs to be thrown down an outside drain, another daily chore for my mother. Like most people in those days, we had no lavatory indoors, so at night everyone used chamber pots in their bedrooms.
Water carrying affords an excellent opportunity for gossip, and it really is surprising what interesting people one meets there. Every conceivable subject is discussed. History, geography, the news, local and distant. Also one hears some good jokes, all of which compensate for the extra walk.
My mother used to buy cockles.
Yeah.
So she had a great big iron bucket, and the cockles would go in there first, and then she'd be rinsing them out every couple of hours to get rid of all the sand with the cold water. And then that was our dinner, not our tea. That was our dinner. And the bread that she'd baked. And she never called us to the table until she cut enough bread, because she couldn't keep up.
In the summer, before the days of refrigerators, it was difficult to keep food fresh. Even milk had to be boiled to prevent it from going sour. We used to call the process scalding the milk. My mother also used the fire for cooking, and in the winter there was often a pan of soup simmering on the hob. It was the same fire that heated the old-fashioned flat iron my mother used. I can vividly remember her ironing the washing spread out on the living room table, the red chenille cloth pushed back to make room for the ironing blanket, and the characteristic smell of the hot iron on damp clothes.
Then she would send me down to the butcher and have 3 penn'orth of cuttings. Now the cuttings were off the joints of beef to make them into nice pieces.
Right.
And that's what you had. And a marrow bone.
Yeah.
So that would be on in a big iron saucepan with water, with some herbs that she used to grow in the garden, and some sage which she would buy and dry. It was always hanging up in the larder.
It had a huge garden which ran all the way back to the railway line. There's a whole road and houses either side, built now in what was the garden. And it sort of went down a dip, and at the bottom we had a great big chicken run, and there were brown chickens and black ones, and mine were the black ones. I was only tiny. I got a lot of pictures of me holding a chicken. I couldn't do that now.
Oh dear, now you're going back. My mother was from St. Florence, as I said. That's where she was born. And Grandpa and Gran, they had chickens and pigs, 2 pigs, and Gran used to go into the pigsty, and she would be rubbing the pig back like that, and the pig would enjoy it. So I think I remember one pig would lie over. When Gran was doing that to the pig, he would just go over. He enjoyed it so much. They had chickens and cockroaches and a few ducks. But that was a lovely time down there for my mother.
Auntie always wore a hat in the house, presumably against the cold. She would certainly have needed a hat when she went out into the yard too, for the only toilet was at the top of the garden, up a steep flight of steps. It was a dry earth toilet, very common in the 1930s, and how she went up and down those steps in all weathers I do not know. One of my vivid memories connected with Auntie Polly was the annual ritual of salting the pig. This took place in her cold scullery or back kitchen in late autumn each year. My uncle owned a few fields around the town, and a smallholder would rear a pig for him. The farmer would kill it and deliver it to my aunt's house, where it would be placed in a large wooden container.
I say shop, but it was actually the front room of Auntie Minnie's cottage. Now, Auntie Minnie was a squat, rotund lady of uncertain age, who owned an equally squat, rotund black Labrador who answered to the name of Rex. Rex followed Auntie Minnie everywhere. What can only be described as a canine stench permeated the shop. Thankfully, and well out of Rex's attention, were jars of Mintos, jelly babies and licorice all sorts which adorned the heaving shelves.
And next door to us was Auntie Maudie. She wasn't an auntie at all. And the doors were open. You could just go in those days, just walk in. And Auntie Maudie would say, "And what do you come for today?" Oh, yes. They were all aunties. There was Auntie Minnie lived opposite. She had a sweet shop. Auntie Minnie, she was, lived opposite here. And she had a shop in the front room. And we used to pop in there with a penny. I had an auntie in the shop collecting eggs and rabbits. We used to go out with her in the van. I had an auntie in St. Florence. That was Mam's sister. She was she had the post office. It was an extension to the house, a shed, and Auntie Gwen used to keep that. One of my aunties was a nurse in Swansea, and during the war, and she was a midwife, and she had her own house in Swansea, Sketty I think it was, and she used to come home sometimes at a weekend, at perhaps once every 3 months or something. She would come home and stay at the house, her home. But on the way home from Narberth Station, she used to walk, all of a sudden she would pop into our house, and all of a sudden then you would hear her on the piano. She was a marvellous pianist, and it would always be a piece called The Rustle of Spring. There you are. And it was a beautiful piece of music. You'd know that Auntie Dolly was down, because this music, this piano piece would be always played, and then everybody knew that she was home. And I'll never forget the piece of music, and it's quite often on the radio, on Classic FM, you will hear it.
Monday, 10th of June 1940. Auntie Jenny came to visit Grandma. Italy declares war. Small German forces cross the Seine. French government withdraws.
The other member of the family who was close to us was my mother's older sister, Polly, whose real name was Mary Elizabeth, born in 1885. I saw Auntie Polly several times a week, and my mother visited her almost daily. I remember Auntie as a gentle, uncomplaining lady. I well remember her swollen knuckles and her twisted fingers, which were always stiff. First thing in the morning, she found it very difficult to move, but gradually as the day went on, she moved more easily, relying on aspirin to kill the pain. She must have been a very pretty girl, and when I knew her, she had a lovely smile and a twinkle in her dark brown eyes, and she was always cheerful in spite of her difficulties.
I loved looking at family photos, and my granny had this old chocolate box, and I was busy looking at these, and there was a picture of a woman in a wren outfit, uniform, and I went and asked Dad who it was, and it was his cousin Anthea.
I remember the war starting, and we were sitting down, and a friend of my mother's, my father was working, it was a Sunday, and Will was working. I'm trying to think of her name now, and I can't remember. But she came in to Mum and said to me, we were waiting for the news on the radio, and we had a new radio. Oh, God, we had a new radio. And I remember sitting on the stand, and she was in the chair, my mother was by the table, when it came and said that we were at war.
Auntie Lily asked me to go up to a little market garden about half a mile away to get some tomatoes. The way to the garden lay through woodland along a cliff-top path. The woods were very still and quiet when I entered them, and I became aware of a distant throbbing hum, almost like the running of an enormous dynamo. I quickened my pace to get to the cliff path as soon as I could, and when I reached a vantage point and looked down across the bay, what a sight met my eyes. There, strung out across the width of the bay, were row upon row of amphibious landing craft.
Saturday, 13th of April. Betty has had her hair permed. Went shopping in town for Mother.
A drink getting into her. And I went to open the kitchen door to go into the hall passage to go up the stairs. And this bomb landed over in Narberth, down by the side of the cemetery. But it didn't hurt the cemetery itself, only the wall and on it. And the door flew out of my hand, and I was fast up against the wall by the fireplace. There was about that much. I had the sand before the cupboards, you know, and in that small space, I was in there. Very frightening, especially when you saw the fire bombs, because they used to light up the whole of the sky, and you didn't know where they would land, you know.
We witnessed all the pre-invasion military exercises in preparation for the D-Day landings. To begin with, no one who lived in the area was allowed to leave it. Thousands of troops were drafted in, and the place was alive with military personnel taking part in exercises of every kind. One early dawn, my father heard a strange noise and went to his bedroom window to be confronted with soldiers in full kit, scaling the walls of the county court building. They were using ropes to haul themselves up. One of them saw my father in the window, called out, "Morning, boss," and carried on climbing.
I can remember a Zeppelin coming over one night during the 1914-18 war. We had to close the shutters on the windows in the dining room. On Armistice Day, I remember walking round the town with other children waving a Union Jack flag.
I was a girl guide in the First World War. We did a lot to help. I remember with a wheelbarrow collecting tins and things in Church Street. The best thing I remember that stood out in my mind was the Baroness de Rutsen in her widow weeds, and I thought she was lovely. I don't know whether she gave us badges or made us girl guides.
I should have said, actually, my mother served during the war in the ATS, and she joined up and she told a lie about her age. And she was actually in London on VE Day.
During the early part of the war, Swansea was heavily bombed and 2 girls' schools from there were hurriedly evacuated to Narberth. We who attended Narberth County School shared the premises of the 2 evacuated schools. We couldn't all have lessons at the same time, so it was arranged that the local children had lessons from 8:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m, and the Swansea girls during the afternoon. This suited us beautifully. No school in the afternoons. Lovely.
Miss Halkin was the infants teacher, diminutive in stature but resolute in her efforts to make her pupils happy. Though many years have passed, I can still hear her repeat, 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, etc. I remember that though Miss Owen was kind and gentle, she was very determined to secure the best possible future for her pupils. In Miss Owen's class, we were taught to use a pen. Ink was stored in inkwells close to the front right-hand edge of your wooden desk.
I vividly remember many things about those early days at school, especially how we wrote on small slates enclosed in a wooden frame. We wrote with a squeaky pencil, itself made of slate, and we rubbed out our mistakes with a piece of wet sponge, which was often evil-smelling and needed a wash. It was a great day when we graduated to pencils and wide-lined notebooks. The lines were in blue and red, and I can still see the carefully rounded letters. The cat sat on the mat. Sentences like this were copied from large rolls of white paper hanging over the blackboard, or from a nail in the wall.
My mother went to the small local grammar school, whose headmaster was Mr. John Morgan. Many of the professional people in the town had been pupils there, including Miss Eva Cole, who taught me in the junior school, and Miss Katie Morgan, who taught me French in the county grammar school. My mother had hoped to be a teacher too, and had started as a pupil teacher, but at the age of 17 became very ill with rheumatic fever, a grave and chronically debilitating illness in those days before the arrival of antibiotics, forcing her to give up the idea of continuing with academic studies.
The infants' room had a peculiar smell. The mingled odours of wooden furniture, chalk dust, sweaty bodies, sawdust were some of its features, and perhaps bits of stale food, for we were allowed to bring biscuits, cake, or an apple to be eaten during morning break.
Chapel was the centre of our social life. Concerts, plays and outings were usually centred around it. The chapel's summer outing was usually to Tenby by train, but my mother remembered having been taken to Amroth or Saundersfoot by horse-drawn wagon.
Well, I courted that girl 7 months in that way, just once a week, on a Wednesday only, and no other time. But today girls and young men must meet 4 or 5 times a week, enough to make them sick of each other before they get married. Once a week is quite enough for anyone, so just one part of the Welsh courtship I very much like, only once a week, whichever night it may be, but courting in the house I don't like.
And it was our Bessie who taught me how to dance, with what I learnt in the hall, the church hall. And it was very difficult because it was twopence a time. Yeah. And we didn't have 2 pennies. Your feet were going different. I couldn't get the one to be still while I did the other one, and still move for ages. Yeah. And then click.
As the train left the station, it went through a tunnel, and windows had to be closed to keep out the smoke and black smuts from the engine, which could easily spoil our clean summer dresses. Soon we were out in the sunshine again, full of excitement. It was the North Beach that had the morning sun, and we sometimes went there first. It was backed by high tree-lined slopes leading down to the harbour, where boats plied to and from Caldy Island.
We'd go up there and pick wimberries and bring them home in a tin for Mum to make tarts or to do what she used to do. Jam sometimes. Make jam, yeah, and preserve them and everything. And then in the woods there was a lot of brambles and everything. So those blackberries, so we'd pick them. And then my mother would make blackberry apple tart and all sorts of things.
As well as day trips to the local beaches, we did have a week's holiday in the summer. In the 1930s, we went many times to Oystermouth on Swansea Bay. The scenery was new. Beyond Carmarthen, the railway ran alongside the sea, and I remember seeing a heron for the first time. Finally, we went through the strange lunar landscape created by the old metal smelters of Landor and into Swansea.